Jess pulled into the news station, frustrated that she didn't have a story that she promised her producers for her Halloween segment. Jess was getting older, and running out of opportunities to become the lead anchorwoman that she always dreamed of. She wasn't an ugly woman by any means, but she wore huge glasses since her prescription would no longer allow her to wear contacts, and the competition at this particular news station rivaled those at much bigger cities, like LA or New York. Boise wasn't nearly that big, thus the stories that were nationwide quality were far and few between. Halloween was a pretty big deal for Idaho viewers, but nothing really jumped out at Jess to make her segment pop. Haunted corn mazes or pet costume contests had been beaten to death, and even then some. Jess needed something new, something scary, something to help her grab national headlines. If her segment was able to do that, she was for sure able to land the lead anchor woman and hopefully move to a bigger station in a bigger city. The team meeting for the station started a bit late, but Jess was early. She waited as her coworkers and producers entered the meeting, with jovial expressions as most of them had already landed the job they wanted. The meeting was going to go over everyone's stories for the upcoming week, which included Halloween. It was time for Jess to pitch her idea to the group, but she remained silent, as most of her cliché ideas had already been taken by other anchors. "I don't really have anything," she said in a defeated tone. The producers' faces clearly held disappointment, but they nodded in support. "Well, that's okay. We have a couple of stories that you could go with, but they aren't exactly breaking news. Meet us after and we can break it down for you," Brian, the head producer, responded, with an odd grin. Brian was about 15 years older and recently divorced. He had made attempts to hang out with Jess for some time now, way before his divorce. Jess smiled politely and the meeting continued. The meeting finally ended, and rather than staying after to meet with Brian, Jess headed straight to the parking lot and jumped into her car. Instead of going home, Jess just waited and checked her emails on her phone, in a last-ditch effort that any of her leads had replied back to her. After a few minutes of seeing no new emails, she started her car, but before she could put it in reverse, someone knocked on her window. To her surprise, it was Shane, her cameraman and good work friend. She smiled and rolled the window down. Shane was in his mid-20s and covered in tattoos. His appearance caused many people to treat him differently, but not Jess. Shane was out there, to say the least. He was in some type of heavy metal band and was constantly talking about conspiracy theories, but was incredibly kind. "Hey Jess, how'd the meeting go? Do you have a good story for us?" Shane said optimistically. Jess's smile slightly faded as she shook her head. "I got nothing that's big, and Brian's trying to meet up again." The two shared a long pause, as both of their careers were on the line. "Well, I guess that's good news, because I think I might have something," Shane replied with a mischievous smile. "Oh boy, well, what do you got?" Jess replied, knowing fully well that it was going to be some conspiracy theory nonsense. Shane smiled and hopped in her passenger seat. "Okay, hear me out on this," Shane started. Jess removed her glasses and rubbed her brow, as Shane spouted off about how he met some girl at this party. Apparently, she was a part of some type of cult, who was trying to summon some entity called the Lord of Flesh. Jess put her glasses back on and gave Shane a look of disappointment. "Alright, buddy, I think we should start drug testing you," Jess said sarcastically. But Shane insisted. "No, seriously, I think we have a story here. I think since you don't have anything, this is worth looking into. Plus, I never ask for anything, and I'm asking you to check this out with me. I know where to go so we can both be concealed and we can have our story." Shane and Jess shared a brief moment of seriousness that they rarely had. Jess paused. "It's either this or meet with Brian." "Okay, fine," Jess said. The two then got prepped for the story and planned on meeting back at the news station around 7. Jess arrived and Shane was already waiting for her in the parking lot. His studio van door was open and he was having a cigarette. Jess pulled into the spot next to him and got out to greet him. Shane put away his cigarette and hopped in the driver's seat, and Jess hopped in the news station van. The two took off from the parking lot and onto the highway. Jess was worried, not for what they were about to investigate, but about her career. If this story flops, then she knew that Brian would have an issue for not having a story for Halloween. Shane was visibly excited to be checking out this story firsthand. Normally, he had been restricted into basic surface-level stories, and nothing with real substance. But to be able to investigate a cult ritual in the middle of the woods for a Halloween story was a dream come true. Shane's GPS eventually led them off the well-lit highway and down some back streets of less populated towns. The sun had set now, and the streets were only illuminated by the yellow headlights of the station's van. Shane then parked the van off the side of a dirt road and exited the van. "Here we are," he said excitedly. "So the location is a good distance into the woods, but I made sure to give us enough time to hike there while I carry this heavy studio camera," Shane said while loading up the heavy camera and the external battery pack. The two set off into the dark woods with nothing but flashlights to guide them. "I can't believe you talked me into this," Jess said out of frustration when the two were clear into the dark woods with nothing around them. Shane looked on his phone and pointed off into the distance. "Oh, please. Not like you had anything better to report on. It's just over this hill, so we need to be quiet." The two did their best to walk up the steep hill with leaves on it, but sure enough, looking down on the other side of the hill was a cleared-out area with a single torch lit. "This is it," Shane whispered. Jess was slightly shocked to see that there was in fact some substance to what Shane was saying. "We got here a little early. They should be coming soon." The two remained silent, and fear began to crawl down their spines when they eventually saw off in the distance a small light coming towards them. Terror didn't even come close to describe what Jess saw. Amongst the many hooded figures were 6 people that had their hands tied behind their backs and were dressed in underwear with black sacks on their head. The sounds of sobbing and dread could be heard from those that were bound. "Oh my gosh," Jess whispered to Shane. "What is this? What are they going to do to those people?" Shane shared a similar reaction as he clearly had no idea what was about to happen. "We need to call the police," Shane whispered. The group of hooded people arrived at the single torch and placed their torches in a circle which illuminated a small area, which had some type of cylindrical structure in the middle, no higher than waist high. "Is that a well?" Jess asked. The two remained silent as the group all circled the well. The people that were bound continued crying as the sacks were removed and could see that they were out in the middle of the woods, with no one to help them. Jess got up and whispered to Shane, "I'm going to call the police. I want you to film what is about to happen, so we have it as evidence." Jess got up and walked down the hill and towards where Shane parked the studio van and called the police. All the while, Shane stayed back and continued to watch what unfolded in front of him, just down the hill. One of the hooded figures then took out a large leather book and opened it. The people in the hoods began to chant as the main figure continued to read. Shane was at a distance at which he should have been able to understand what was being said, but the words must have been foreign. As the main figure continued to read, the book then began to levitate slightly. Everyone in the hoods began to look anxiously. "This has never happened before," one of the people exclaimed. Everyone, including the person reading the book, looked astonished. The people that were still bound began to cry harder, as they knew that things were about to get worse. The person reading the book looked shocked, but continued reading until the book hovered over the well and began to emit this black liquid from its pages. The book bled this liquid until it stopped and eventually fell into the well, causing everyone to be silent. Judging from the reactions of the cultists, this had never happened before. Shane stayed silent and filmed quietly as he watched what had happened next. A dark purple light emitted from the well, casting light and shadow all around the woods. The cultists fell down, including those that were bound, and a figure began to come out of the well. Out of the well came a tall figure that looked similar to a human, but its features were greatly distorted. Its head had no hair, and it had holes from where its eyes once were, but had clearly been gouged some time ago. Its mouth was greatly exaggerated, as hooks pulled what little flesh it had away from its teeth to show a huge mouth. Its body was naked, but had no genitals nor features to distinguish a gender. It looked like a demon from hell that had been suffering for a century, but also like an alien, as if it held some type of intelligence. The cultist looked on in terror as this figure fully levitated out of the well and displayed itself with wide arms. It spoke with an unknown language, but all those that heard it were able to hear its voice in their minds speak English.
I am the Lord of Flesh. You have released me from my exile on a plane of existence in which suffering is overflowing. Having freed me, I will grant unto you one wish for every soul you bring me.
The cultists were too stunned to speak, and just stared at this monstrosity that stood before them. Finally, the one who spoke the words of the book finally stood and grabbed one of the bound people. "Here's my sacrifice. I wish to serve you." The Lord of Flesh turned and faced the cultist, whose hood was no longer covering his face.
Are you sure? Once you give me your sacrifice, there is no going back.
The cultist paused and remained silent. After a small moment of uneasiness, he finally gave a nod. The Lord of Flesh then expanded his mouth wide and inserted the head of the screaming sacrifice into his mouth and crushed him with its teeth. The person only squirmed at first, but then went limp as the creature continued chewing until it was able to swallow its head. The Lord of Flesh then discarded the rest of the body and stretched out its hand to the cultist.
As you wish. You will serve me as one of my followers.
The cultist then fell down and began to shout in pain. The cultist's limbs began to grow and snap into strange shapes and angles as his head began to morph into that of a wolf-like creature.
I have given you the power of the Skinwalker, so that you might serve me.
The bound sacrifices screamed in horror as they saw what their fate would soon become. The Lord of Flesh then looked around the rest of the cult.
Who wishes to serve me?
Another cultist stepped forward, bringing along a weeping sacrifice, begging to be let free. The cultists removed their hood and bowed as the Lord of Flesh proceeded to widen its mouth again, and drew the terrified head into the gaping hole filled with teeth. The screams could still be heard from inside the mouth of the Lord of Flesh as it clenched down again. Brains spewed out of its mouth as it finally crushed the skull. The Lord of Flesh finished and discarded the body much like the other one.
I will give unto you the ability to haunt those that you see. You now have the power of the rake.
The cultist began to transform. His body began to pop and sizzle as his skin turned gray and his hands and feet began to grow large fingers that had talons coming out of them. His eyes began to go black and his jaw snapped open as more razor-sharp teeth began to fill his mouth. Shane could tell that this man was immediately regretting his decision to follow the Lord of Flesh. The pain must have been excruciating, as Shane could hear his body clearly twist in terror into this new creature. All he could do was watch and film as this creature from another dimension continued to turn these people into these creatures. Jess was able to make it out of the woods and back to the studio van and called the police. She was dispatched to the local police station that was about 40 minutes away. She told them what was happening and gave them the location of where she was. "We will be sending you police units now. We advise that you stay by your vehicle and away from the danger. Do not go back to the cult site. The police are on their way." Jess hung up her phone and debated on calling Shane. She knew that if she called them, there was a chance that his phone would notify the cult, and he would be their next victim. She had a decision to make. Does she stay safe by her vehicle, or does she go back to save her friend Shane? An hour passes, and the police arrive at the news station van, but no one is there. It's very late, and the night is cold. Officers Fields and Redding exit their cruisers and report back that they found the van, but there was no sign of the woman that made the call. Another cruiser pulls up with Officers Garcia and Wallace, and they exit their vehicles. "Do we have any sign of the woman?" Garcia asked while putting on her police jacket. Fields was inspecting the vehicle and Redding answered her. "There's no sign of the woman and the vehicle's engine is cold. The call said that there was people in the woods that were in danger, so the woman either went back and helped or something got her." Garcia shook her head. "How hard is it for people to listen to instructions? Now we don't know where to go." Wallace walked over to Garcia and sighed. "Well, what should we do?" Wallace asked while glancing into the surrounding woods. "Let's poke inside the woods and see if we can find anything. Call for backup and let them know that the woman is gone." Wallace nodded. "You sure we should go into the woods without backup?" Fields asked, clearly concerned. "Fields, give me a break. Just because you're a rookie doesn't mean you get to chicken out all the time. Plus, I have a couple machine guns in the back of my cruiser if it makes you feel any better." "Are those up for grabs?" Officer Redding said while still inspecting the van with a flashlight. "Only if you're going into the woods," Garcia responded. The three officers loaded up, and Wallace ended up staying back in order to help direct backup. "All right, let's just check out the woods quickly and head back. We're not going to try to be heroes and end up getting lost and needing to be rescued ourselves. Got it? Also, if you see anything looking suspicious, try to use discretion, but don't get yourself killed. These cultists aren't to be played with," Garcia instructed as she picked up a shotgun with a flashlight undermount and started heading into the woods. Redding, Fields, and Garcia entered the woods fully armed. The woods were dark, but they were incredibly quiet. It wouldn't be easy to see anyone, but they should be able to hear anything. The three were quiet, trying their best to move forward while listening for any signs of the woman who might have made that call, or any of the cult members. It didn't take them long for them to find a light shining on the ground, a good ways away into the woods. The three police officers looked at each other and silently went to go investigate. On the ground on top of the leaves was a phone that was on the home screen. Redding bent down and picked it up. Redding checked the call history, and sure enough, a 911 call was made over an hour ago. "I think this was the woman's phone," Redding whispered while handing the phone to Garcia. "What should we do? Should we press on a bit more or head back?" Garcia paused and thought. She looked back to the entrance of the woods and back at the phone. "This woman is probably in trouble. Let's see if we can find her before something happens to her." Garcia pocketed the phone and led their way deeper into the woods. 15 minutes later, the three quietly searched the woods, as they then heard a bizarre sound that caused them all to stop. A howl erupted just ahead of them, causing them to stop. Garcia's hands began to sweat as she raised her shotgun's light in the direction of the sound. "There shouldn't be any wolves here," she whispered. "Something's not right," Fields whispered as he began to breathe more and more rapidly. "Quick, turn off your lights," Garcia instructed while crouching down and aiming her weapon up ahead. The other two hesitated, seeing how they would be in complete darkness, but they followed orders. The three sat in silence and in complete darkness as they waited for their senses to adapt to the dark. Sure enough, a dull orange glow could be seen coming from the other side of the hill that was just in front of them. The three quietly walked towards the hill in darkness, hoping it would be enough to conceal them. They reached the bottom of the hill and found a large news camera still rolling and laying on the ground. "What is this doing here?" Fields asked quietly. Garcia inspected the equipment and realized that whatever was going on out here was probably captured on this camera. "We need to get this camera back to Wallace and show backup, Fields. Why don't you take it back and tell him where to find us?" Garcia commanded as she and Redding kept walking up the hill. Fields didn't hesitate and took off silently with the camera, making his way back through the dark woods. Garcia and Redding reached the top of the hill to see a small mound of headless bodies at the foot of the Lord of Flesh. They both gasped as they saw this hideous creature surrounded by all these different types of beasts. Some had twisted antlers and sharp teeth, while others looked almost human, if they weren't 8 feet tall and without faces. Others looked like aliens, while one looked like a man with a goat's head. Each creature was different, but equally terrifying in that they all looked predatory. In front of the Lord of Flesh was a woman who was missing an arm, and a man on his knees. "Don't do it, Shane," the woman missing the arm screamed as the man trembled before the hideous leader.
You will either serve me or you will suffer beyond your imagination.
The man was crying and shaking in pain as a wolf-like creature stood on 2 legs behind him and began to slowly clench its claw into his shoulder. Shane tried to hold off, but the pain was too much. "Fine, I'll do it, just don't." A shot rang out from the hill. Redding shot the dogman, clinching Shane, but to no effect. The Lord of Flesh looked on the hill and pointed, sending all types of monsters to get them. Redding and Garcia began firing at all the creatures, but none of them seemed to be affected.
My servants have been given my power, and only I know how to kill them.
Fields heard the gunfire and immediately started sprinting back to Wallace. The heavy camera was awkward, since he was already carrying a machine gun. So he set the camera down and ejected the tape and continued sprinting. Wallace could hear the gunshots from the cruiser and radioed in for more backup. As Garcia and Redding were being torn limb from limb, the Lord of Flesh approached Shane, who laid on the ground crying. "You are not worthy to serve me."
You reek of fear, and your loyalty is amongst your own.
The Lord of Flesh opened its mouth wide as he picked him up and bit his head off. Jess laid on the ground screaming, trying her best to not pass out from the blood loss. The backup arrived, but not in time. The 7 or so police cruisers arrived to see Wallace and Fields waving them down, but something was off. Instead of having them park and help, Wallace and Fields ran to the first cruiser that they could and jumped in. "We need to get out of here. There's something going on in these woods, and it's out of our control," Fields told the officer trying to park the cruiser. "Trust us, we have everything on tape, we just need to leave now." The officer in the first cruiser was still talking to Wallace and Fields when the other 6 sets of officers were exiting the vehicle. "What did you boys see out there?" the officer driving the cruiser asked. Before either of the officers could respond, a series of unmarked vans and blacked-out SUVs pulled up. Soldiers dressed in hazmat suits and agents in suits began to pour out into the scene. "Great. Who are these guys?" one of the officers asked. A helicopter could be heard approaching the scene as the police chief exited his vehicle. Heavily armed vehicles parked, blocking the police cruisers from the woods. Chief Davidson exited his cruiser and approached Wallace and Fields. "What happened here?" Before either of the officers could respond, the police chief was then approached by a man in a dark suit and a well-trimmed beard, who was accompanied by 2 geared-up soldiers. "Good evening, gentlemen. I can assume you to be the one in charge," the man in the suit said calmly. "Yes, I'm Chief Davidson. Who are you?" The man in the suit then flashed a badge from under his coat. "I'm afraid I can't tell you what part of the government I work for, but you may call me Director Borsky. I'll be taking over. I'll be needing all the information in regards to what has happened here." Chief Davidson was astounded and turned to both Wallace and Fields. "Share with the director what you have." Fields tried handing the director the tape, but was immediately intercepted by one of the men carrying a large machine gun. "Do not approach the director," yelled the soldier as he snatched the tape from him. Fields stepped back, astonished. "Thank you for your cooperation, gentlemen. You all may go home," Borsky said while turning away. "Wait, don't you want our help?" Wallace shouted. The director stopped and turned to face him. "As a matter of fact, I will be needing the officers who saw what had happened here to stay here for questioning. Everyone else will be gone in the next 5 minutes, or I will be forced to remove you from my crime scene." Borsky turned and walked away while being handed the tape from the soldier. Wallace and Fields shared a concerned look with the chief as every police officer eventually left the scene. A woman in a business suit holding an iPad approached the two remaining officers. "Officers, will you please follow me to my vehicle for questioning? Oh, and I'll also be needing your weapons." Fields and Wallace were worried. "We're state-appointed policemen of the state of Idaho. We are required to be armed while on duty." The woman smiled. "Of course, and we're very grateful. However, we're about to take you to our facility, which does not allow unauthorized weapons." The two soldiers that were standing next to the woman raised their guns slightly, indicating that this was an order and not a request. Wallace handed over his pistol and Fields gave his machine gun and pistol to both soldiers, who took them and they all followed the woman. Borsky took the tape and handed it to another man. "Tell me what's on the tape within the hour. I want to know what we're dealing with. Also, get me in contact with Detective Slater. I'll be needing his expertise and that friend of his, Mr. White, before sunrise." 2 hours passed and there was a knock on Detective Slater's door. It was around 4 a.m, but he was still awake. Slater grabbed his pistol and peered out the door to see a woman in the suit, with a handful of soldiers behind her. Slater was genuinely confused. "Who is it?" he yelled. "It's the United States government. There's been a situation and we need you to come in." Slater paused. "Why do they need me?" he thought. "We're not actually here for you. We're here for Mr. White." Slater was stunned. "We are not here to arrest you. There's been an incident and we think there's something much worse than just one Wendigo." Slater opened the door and agreed. "I knew you would understand," the woman said, smiling. A soldier then placed a sack on his head and guided him to one of the SUVs, and they took off into the night. After an hour, the sack was removed and Slater was sitting in a dark room with the TV and the woman. The two then watched the entirety of the film of what happened in the woods, with the Lord of Flesh turning all of his followers into various cryptids. Slater was stunned. "What do you want me to do? Have Mr. White kill them all?" "No, I'm afraid it's not that simple. We need to figure out how to kill each one and this Lord of Flesh before it turns the rest of the world into these monsters. We have been told that you know more than your fair share about these things, and you know how to stop them." Slater was silent, but also relieved. "If you help us with this, then we'll leave you and your friend alone, but if you decline, it'll be the last thing you do," the woman said plainly. "It would appear that I don't have much of a choice. The first creature is a skinwalker. Those can be killed by an ash bullet, or if you know the name of the person, then you can kill them by saying it to them. The next is a Wendigo. Those can be killed by fire or damaging their brains. The dogmen don't like silver, so I think that's how they die. But as for the goatman and the rag and slenderman, I don't know if those can be killed." Slater and the woman were silent. At that moment, Director Borsky entered the room with a small gray alien and sat down. "Here's the deal," Borsky said while leaning forward. "I will give you any resource you need, including my friend here, in order to kill these followers, but I want you to bring me this Lord of Flesh, alive." Slater shook his head, as he had seen this type of alien before. "The last time I saw one of those, it tried to kill me." Borsky smiled wide. "We know. However, my friend Bob here is a part of the department, and he will be vital to this operation. He won't harm you." Bob waved to lighten the mood. "Bob here can shapeshift, and to a degree able to use telekinesis and telepathy. This should make the playing field somewhat even." Slater exhaled and shook his head. "How am I supposed to capture this Flesh guy without him killing us?" Slater said, frustrated. The director got up and walked over to the door. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," Borsky muttered as he exited the room. Bob and Slater shared a brief moment where the two just looked at each other. "I don't have to look like this," Slater heard in his mind, but the voice wasn't his. "In fact, I can look like you." Bob then transformed into a similar-looking man around the same age as Slater. "Just try not to get in the way, Bob." Slater took the two officers, Wallace and Fields, and were given a small team for him to lead, as well as his new teammate Bob. The team included 8 soldiers, a handful of military-grade vehicles, and an infinite amount of weaponry and ammunition. Out of the weapons, Slater only took with him several machine guns and a couple of high-powered sniper rifles and 3 flamethrowers. The rest would be useless, and even the ones he picked out would need alterations to make them fatal to the creatures. Slater and Bob gathered the team and briefed them on what they were about to do. Good evening, team, or should I say good morning at this point. I'm Detective Slater, and this is my new partner, Bob. We will be hunting several entities and cryptids that have powers and abilities that we will need to assess before we engage them. The first cryptid that we will be pursuing is the Dogman. We need to be extra cautious, seeing how only silver objects can harm it, and this creature is incredibly fast and strong. Bob then began handing out boxes of silver bullets as Slater continued talking. The goal here is to pick off these cryptids one at a time. Altogether, they'll be nearly impossible to stop. It is vital that we stop this flesh guy before he and his followers hit a major city and cause real problems. The team started loading their weapons with silver bullets as Slater continued. There has been a sighting on the way to this small town about 30 minutes ago, and we need to check it out. Any questions? The soldiers looked unfazed by the news, but Wallace and Fields were stunned. Fields raised his hand. What if we don't want to do this? He asked, cowardly. This is a top-secret mission. You will be held in detainment until we eradicate all these entities, Slater said coldly. Trust me, buddy, you are not backing out of this, one of the soldiers whispered. The team loaded up in several vehicles with all the equipment. It was 6 in the morning, but the sun showed no sign of rising. They all drove in unison to a small town, hoping to stop the reign of terror before it began. To their horror, the small town of 8,000 people appeared to be abandoned. Most stores were dark, but the ones that weren't didn't have anyone inside. The team parked at the first building and all got in formation. Slater and Fields led one team, while Wallace and Bob led the other. We're taking the left side of the street, and you guys take the right. Notify the other team before engaging. Slater and Fields began their sweep of the town, which was incredibly eerie. The buildings were pretty old, but still usable. Do you think they're even here? Fields asked, out of concern. I'm not sure, whispered Slater, as he focused on the task. Halfway through the search, Wallace and Bob radioed over. Slater, we got signs of a cryptid here. We are at the hospital across town, and there's blood everywhere in the lobby. We will wait for you before we proceed. Slater and Fields double-timed the team over to the hospital and met up with Wallace and Bob. Wallace was looking at his watch and was concerned. It's 8:30. Where's the sun? Wallace asked. It was still pitch dark outside. It would appear that the earth had stopped rotating, Bob said. The sooner we find this guy, the better. Bob, notify the director that we need backup on this location, Slater said. Okay, let's sweep this building. There's a good chance that there might be something here. The two teams converged into one, and Slater led the way. Inside the hospital, the lobby was absolutely destroyed. There was a strong indication of a struggle with something large. The team searched the main floor with no signs of people aside from the vast amounts of blood. I don't get it, Slater. Where are the bodies from all this blood? Fields asked. Without looking, Slater responded. They aren't trying to kill everyone. They're trying to convert them. The team followed the blood that led to a set of stairs leading down into a dark basement. Bob told Slater telepathically that there were several unknown life forms down below. Slater motioned with his hand, notifying his team to get ready as they descended the stairs. The basement stairs were covered in blood, and the lights on the stairs stopped working the further they went down. Slater signaled for a flamethrower to be brought to the front as they reached the bottom. The soldier manning the flamethrower ignited the weapon. They turned the corner to see an empty hall, but screams could be heard from deep within. Not just a few, but many. We have to stop them before they get more, Wallace whispered. Slater nodded. The team pressed silently down the hallway and turned the corner. Slater's light shined, revealing 30 or so people facing the wall, and the number of cryptids had tripled since the last interaction. The Lord of Flesh had converted more beasts to his foul army. Standing behind the people were many types of monsters, but the Lord of Flesh was not there. "Take them out!" Slater screamed as a flurry of bullets ripped from the many guns pointed down the hallway. The beasts were caught off guard as several of them fell from the silver bullets. Several dogmen began to howl with pain as the silver ripped them apart, but the other cryptids seemed to not take any damage. Some of the dogmen tried to attack, but were quickly mowed down. However, several other cryptids began to press the team. Slater called up the flamethrower and unleashed a devilish flame that illuminated the entire hallway of the basement. The flames ignited several beings and the rest of the humans that did not convert. The screams were horrendous. However, there were still some cryptids that were not affected from the silver nor the flames. A rake creature jumped on the flamethrower and began slashing at his stomach. Several more began to crawl towards them, and the team started to pull back. Fields tried to shoot the rake off the soldier, but to no effect. One of his bullets hit the gas tank, causing the tank to let out a loud hiss, releasing all the gas. "Everyone upstairs!" Slater screamed. The hiss from the tank almost immediately touched the front nozzle holding the flame, and a small explosion erupted. Bob stepped forward, turning back into his original form, and projected a purple force field, separating the explosion from the team. The blast knocked back many creatures, but they were getting up almost immediately. The team ran up the stairs and the sound of a distant helicopter could be heard in the distance. "Slater, we need to get to the roof where the helicopter pad is. They can pick us up from there," Bob said telepathically to Slater. "We need to get to the roof!" Slater screamed as the creatures started to ascend from the basement. At this point, their weapons were useless. All the cryptids that remained were no longer affected by the bullets nor the flame. Despite their initial attack, there were still many cryptids very much alive. Slater was then jumped by one of the creatures and screamed out of pain. Bob turned to help, but it was too late. Slater was already swarmed by the beasts. Bob led the team up the stairs and through the hospital to reach the roof. Slater was being cut from all sides of his body when he began to transform into Mr. White. Mr. White's Wendigo form caused the beast to stop attacking him, since he was now one of them. But Slater was still in control of his mind. "Mr. White, we need to hold these guys off until our team is able to get out of here." Mr. White then got up and began to crush the smaller cryptids with his large talon-filled claws. The cryptids then turned on him again, but to no avail. Mr. White's Wendigo form was too powerful for 2 or even 3 monsters at once, but there were still dozens and dozens coming out of the basement. Seeing that the monsters were no longer going for his team, Mr. White then fled from the stairs, seeing how if he kept this up that he would soon die, even in his Wendigo form. 2 choppers landed on the roof and picked up the team, taking them back to safety. Mr. White was left at the hospital and took refuge in the nearby woods. This was going to be much more difficult than he thought. The cryptids alone almost killed Slater and his team, had it not been for Bob and Mr. White. Slater needed more help, and he knew exactly who to go to. Slater was able to radio to Bob that he was still alive and to pick him up. It was 10 a.m. now, and the sun still hadn't rose. The earth was just as dark as it was when the Lord of Flesh appeared. A chopper was sent to pick up Slater, but inside to greet him was Bob, Fields, Wallace, and Borsky. Bob was flying the chopper, and Borsky jumped out to greet him. "So, you took out a handful, but nowhere near all of them. The Lord of Flesh wasn't even there, and he beat you. What are we gonna do?" Borsky said, frustrated. Slater hung his head. "I know of one more person that might be able to help us, but she's unreliable. There's a witch in the woods, and she knows how to kill any cryptid. Last time I talked to her, she got my client killed. We are out of options. If we don't get this earth spinning soon, then we're all gonna die," Borsky said while getting in the chopper. "Let's go find her." Slater jumped into the chopper, and Bob read his mind, telling him where the witch was. Bob flew the chopper 2 hours north to an eerie set of woods where the cave to the witch was. They landed in a small clearing not far away, and Slater led the way. Bob stayed in his alien form and Borsky and the other officers followed while holding rifles. Slater was able to find the cave again, but there was something wrong when they approached the opening. Outside the cave were hundreds of people in a zombie-like state. Amongst the people were various cryptids and even aliens that looked monstrous. "What is this?" Slater whispered. The group stopped, seeing that there was something off about where this witch was staying. "She is in there with him," Bob said telepathically to Slater. "He can't use his powers in there. The witch put a curse on that cave and no one has power in there but her," Slater whispered to the group. "Now is the time to kill him. But how do we get past the army of followers?" Fields whined from the back. "I have a theory, but it's risky," Wallace said, as he placed his weapon down and walked towards the followers. "You said his powers won't work, right, while he's in the cave? So his followers shouldn't attack us." The group was silent. "That's risky, but it's worth a shot," Borsky said while laying down his gun. "Bob and Mr. White should be able to protect us if this goes south, right?" Wallace approached the cave and sure enough, the followers were unresponsive. The rest of the group saw this and followed behind and entered the cave with Wallace. Once inside, the group made their way through the cursed cave, feeling dread and fear deepen with each step. Once inside, the Lord of Flesh and the witch turned to see the group enter the small cave.
"Slater, what a lovely surprise," the witch said with black teeth. "I'm sure you met my new best friend. His work is amazing," she hissed, with an evil smile. "I'm here to bargain with you. This Lord of Flesh will destroy this planet if we don't stop him. A planet that you live on," Slater said.
I am granting her royalty on my own planet,
the Lord of Flesh said while smiling.
She will have an infinite amount of souls to torment if she follows me.
The Lord of Flesh walked over to Borsky.
Do you remember me? To me it felt like eons, but for you, it was only a couple of years.
Borsky looked shocked. "I've seen a lot of things in my time, but I haven't had the misfortune of meeting you."
Of course you know me. We used to work together to kill those things like him,
the Lord of Flesh said while pointing to Slater. Borsky paused. "The only person I killed a Wendigo with was..." The Lord of Flesh smiled.
That's right. I used to go by the name of Agent Johnson, but that was before. I have now ascended beyond and have shown many a great and terrible things. Things I want to show you.
"How is this possible?" Borsky gasped.
The portal I use doesn't just travel through time, but also space. I used the portal to save that one family from turning into Wendigos, but I decided not to stop there. Why not use it to travel through space? I have traveled to many places, most of which were inhospitable, but I eventually found a new planet filled with pain and horror. It turned me into this, and I now wield unrivaled power. I'll make a deal with you. You guys give me Borsky and I'll go back to where I came from, but my followers stay behind. What do you think?
The Lord of Flesh said while smiling wide. Borsky was shocked. "I'm not going anywhere with you," he said while pulling out a pistol. Slater and Bob immediately jumped the director and wrestled the gun from his hand. "Take him and leave," Slater said.
Only one small problem. This witch won't cast me a portal unless I offer her something she wants. She wants the spirit of a Wendigo, but I can only transform her permanently. She wants to be able to turn at her own will. We all know how this ends for you, Slater. She must eat you. Much how you ate your father to become who you are today,
the Lord of Flesh said. Slater paused. "No, there must be another way," Wallace said. "No. I promised this witch a while ago that she could eat me once I died. Today seems as good as any," Slater said with a slight hint of sadness. The witch jumped up and down and started dancing, and she made her way over to Slater.
"Don't worry, dear. I'll be sure to kill you first," she said with a smile.
She slashed his throat with her sharp fingernails and began twisting his head off. With a quick snap and tear, she pulled his head off and his neck and head still bled.
"Oh, how I wanted this for some time now,"
she said while holding her prized trophy. She then casted a portal on the far wall. The blue hole in space twirled as the Lord of Flesh grabbed the struggling Borsky by the throat and walked over to the portal. "This isn't the last you'll be seeing me," Borsky screamed as he and the Lord of Flesh walked through. The portal closed, and Bob, Wallace, and Fields were left inside the cave as the witch began feasting on Slater's body. "Did we win? Is it over?" Fields said, confused. "We still have his followers to deal with," Bob said, as he and Wallace turned to leave the cave. The three left the cave to see that all the followers had left and had scattered into the nearby woods. The sun began to rise in the distance as the three walked through the woods, back to the helicopter.